what you don't know, you can say, oh, I'd like to learn more about this, okay? So make sure you ask the question. Okay. Right. We'll go and have a look at some more of these. We talked about the OECD before. As I said, by the end of the 1980s into the 1990s, we had the CABRI and we had some other inquiries in the UK. So the idea of getting corporate governance principles, keep in mind the OECD is Paris-based, but it's predominantly, it gets a mixture of funding. So whenever you look at global organisations, the most important thing is to say, where do they get the money from? Because whichever countries fund organisations tend to call the tunes about what, even though they're called international organisations. World Bank predominantly gets funds from America, generally sings the American economic song. OECD gets a mix of funding, even though it's European headquartered in Paris, it again sings predominantly an Anglo-American type message. And so they got picked up on corporate governance. They said, we want to promote investment globally. It's OECD is made up of the developed countries. Who are the members? I think about 30-odd countries are members. So it's all your advanced countries out of Europe, Canada, US, Australia, Korea, Japan. You know, they're the countries. These are the big guys. About 95% of the world's total GDP comes out of countries running that are in the OECD. And they're cooperating. Now, what were they going to do? They want to expand into emerging markets, into Africa, Asia, etc. So they said, oh, we need to spread this so we can facilitate and grow investment. That's the background. That's the story of why this happened. And they basically said, well, lots of countries. I was in Vietnam in 1999, 2001, 2003. We worked on projects for the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and groups like that. They were implementing OECD principles through World Bank funding and Asian Development Bank funding into Vietnam. Many of the people I worked with had worked in Africa, in Kenya, in Tanzania. Some had worked in Soviet, ex-Soviet satellite countries, I think Georgia and different places. I had Americans and Europeans. Oh yeah, I worked on this project here, there, everywhere. So I was an academic, so I didn't have the opportunity to work in a lot of those countries. But we were all picking up this stuff from the OECD. So people had their OECD manuals, and they had their SEC manuals, their European Union manuals, and they all would bring in their own manuals, say, this is what we've got to do. We want to spread this corporate governance stuff around the world, get the same systems. And so I wrote a number of reports along with my colleagues. We keep in mind at this time you've got country, particularly in Vietnam, you had the beginning of the Doi Moi, the opening up of the economy, and you've got what you call equitization, we call privatization. The Vietnamese use the term equitization of state-owned enterprises, creating shareholder capital. And so you're trying to do this, move from what was seen as bad corporate governance, because you've got state ownership, to private ownership, to improve corporate performance, to improve the economic position of countries. So we need good corporate governance. So you go along to meet directors of companies and say, what you need, or what do you need? You need to develop strategies to communicate to shareholders. These people had never talked to shareholders. Many of the directors or the chairman of companies, what was their sole position? They were the chair of the local branch of the party, Communist Party, Vietnam. That's why they were the chairman of that company. I've got this company, that company. They ran those. So I sat down with many of these people, and what did they want to do? They wanted to know how they could get rich. Boom, 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 boom. Oh, we're going to be private. Oh, how do I get more money? That's all they ever came and asked me. Oh, tell me how I can get more money. I can get more shares for myself. Can I issue bonus shares? Can I get this? Come and ask you all these kind of questions. I say, oh, that's not my job. My job is to help you get good corporate governance, not to get rich. But they only want to get rich, which they probably did. They're probably all much richer than me, but that's the name of the game. So that's an interesting sort of experience, is sort of working with people in emerging markets and seeing how they try to adopt these principles in their own ways, and to explain to them particularly how to look after shareholders, because they weren't used to dealing with shareholders, particularly minority shareholders. So one of the things that we need to focus on is how you balance all the different interests of shareholders. Because the board of directors, although they get elected by or maybe nominated through one group of shareholders, they're there to represent everybody. So their job is to look after the small shareholder as well as the big shareholders. So this is the key thing that we start talking with people about, is shareholder rights. Making sure that particularly in new countries, how do you register shares? How do you transfer ownership interests in companies? And how this information, and we spent a lot of time working with the Securities Institute or Securities Commission, State Securities Commission in Hanoi, working out rules and guidance on share transfer systems, share registries. Now most of those today are all computerized automated systems for transfer of titles, because that underpins the stock market. You've got to have efficient share registries. Who's on the board? Who are the shareholders? What's their current shareholding? When they buy or sell or add to that, how that information gets managed between the company and the stock exchange, and is supervised through the securities commissions, and also linked usually to the taxation officers. So the tax people need to know all this so they can pick up any taxation or transfer duties or profit and loss, capital gains taxes and things like that. One of the other things is, how do you run a meeting? How do you run a general meeting? How do you handle inquiries from shareholders and questions? None of this had previously happened in many emerging markets. And so the idea of shareholders, and we've seen in the West, particularly in the last decade or so, what we call shareholder activism. Shareholders now will run petitions, get votes, try to influence boards about policies, about their products, about their markets they may enter. So there's a lot what we call shareholder activism today. And a lot more pressure now on strategies to try and change the directors. They don't like a director running campaigns to remove company directors. So all of these things are very lively. There's a lot of stuff in the media about this all the time now. Virtually every day we've seen in the last few weeks in the Australian financial press questioning about the appointment of directors, the compensation payments to directors, about the way meetings have been run, and things like that. So these are all, and of course there are a whole lot of formal rules for running meetings, for inviting questions, for listening and holding those and managing the debate. Now, this is sort of the general stuff. Now, the question then is, the board of directors is there to oversee the company on behalf of the shareholders, and it will take key decisions, but what should it tell the shareholders? And basically, the OECD basically takes the view that major transactions or events, things that are likely to significantly affect the company, they all need to be approved or reported and discussed by the shareholders. So if you're going to change your key business activities, usually company takeovers, or particularly things that involve new share issues, because that will dilute or change the proportion of existing shares, all these sorts of things need to be disclosed. And we've seen a lot of discussion also about, in this last point, different voting rights for different shareholder classes. So we've got various types of preference shares or super voting rights attaching to certain classes of shares. All of these things get debated. You know, some companies have very complex share structures. They'll have lots of different classes of shares. Some are voting shares, some are non-voting shares. And of course, the most famous company that gets debated about this is News Corporation. You know, Rupert Murdoch, you're familiar with this guy? Rupert Murdoch, News Corp, one of the world's big media companies. Rupert Murdoch we pay a lot of attention to him in Australia because he was originally an Australian, and News Corporation was originally an Australian company, but he moved to the United States and runs News Corp out of the US. So they have Fox, the Fox Television, Fox Media channels and those kind of things as part of their global interests, B-Sky B and a lot of other media interests. Rupert Murdoch and his family only have a small percentage of the equity in News Corp, but they run that company because they control the majority of the voting shares. Most of the shares you can buy on the stock market in News Corporation are non-voting shares. So they don't have any votes attached. You get a dividend, the company will pay you profits or share profits, but you don't get a vote in it. So there's a question, and this company often gets discussed, is this a good corporate governance? Is this a good company? Can you have non-voting shares? Would you like to be a citizen of a country where you don't have a vote in the government? You could be, I'll be a non-voting citizen, you know. People don't want that. So maybe anyway, this is the kind of thing that's evolved, that in corporate law, it's not necessarily good corporate governance to have non-voting shares. But in some companies, they've evolved and developed that way. Now that's enabled some families to control companies that they don't have a majority ownership in. They still control the company because they control all the votes. I think there's a few European companies that have that. I think Porsche has that kind of structure too, where the family, the Porsche family, whatever their name is, it's not Porsche family, but there's a family that own Porsche. Basically own all the voting shares, and all the other investors don't have any voting shares, but they put money in. So there's a few European companies that operate this way, and there's no doubt companies around the world that have this voting, non-voting distinction. So there's a lot of controversial issues around that, but these are the basic principles that OECD said we should look at around shareholder rights. So that's a pretty key one. Treatment of shareholders. Now again, we've got other countries have different, and China's a good example, I think Vietnam too, some of these countries have different rules if you're a foreign national to being, if you're a national of the country versus being a foreign investor. Some have restrictions on that. Most, well, the OECD has this insider trading rule, you know, and this is a big one. People go to jail. We saw people in America in recent years spend, 50 years or 100 years in jail for insider trading, and often huge fines attached. They just had caught one of the big guys from the Salomon Brothers, or one of those. I think it was that company. Yeah. He'd been getting inside deals and making lots of money. So you do spend a lot of time in some countries in jail. Other countries, they don't have rules about insider trading. So it becomes issues then about investor confidence. So generally, if you've got the whole philosophy behind the stock market, is everybody should be informed. It's a fair playing field. So then you've got investors who are prepared to invest because they don't think someone's got a better deal. And one of the key things is, if we know what all the directors have and the senior executives, what are the kind of interests and deals? We talk about that as related party transactions and the kind of disclosures around those. And that helps us make our mind up as a shareholder that we know what's going on, that these executives, or maybe non-executives, don't have something going on up here that's in their own best interest. So we want to make sure those things happen. So they're all very important elements. other issues around protecting other stakeholders. First point really about creditor protection. A lot of other, besides shareholders, a lot of other people have put money into companies. Although the board of directors doesn't necessarily act in the creditor's interest, they have a responsibility not to defraud their creditors, and so there's usually some other legal protections. And the whole idea that if you've got everybody cooperating together in this circle, then you're going to grow the business. So you have performance arrangements and participation of particularly employees in organisations. We know now a lot of companies also include consumers. So they capture their consumer and build that brand loyalty by bringing consumers and employees and everybody into that cycle to try and grow the wealth of the business. We talked about the disclosure issues. We'll kind of come back to some of these. Certainly we need to know all about what the company's earned, its financial performance, and its financial position, that are part of our triangle. We need to know all about our ownership interests in the company, so we need to have what we call a transparent share register. Now, there's a lot of reasons people don't want to disclose that, their true ownership. So they might have dummy companies and offshore companies and trusts and various other things interposed between the real owners and the public. And so there's a lot of laws to try and make sure that we do find out who are the real owners of companies. And so this is a critical issue, because then we understand who is driving the ownership, particularly these election of directors. So who are the real people voting, not just the trusts or the interposed entities. And there's a lot of lawyers have a lot of fun because they can create a whole lot of dummy corporations or trusts or other special purpose entities along a line, normally crossing multiple country barriers through different jurisdictions to try and hide a real owner somewhere. It could be an African dictator. But what's happened, and this is one of the other things that's been really significant in the post 9/11 world, is American terrorism laws have put accountants at virtually the front line of fighting global terrorism. So the legal and accounting positions now are very powerful in peeling back hidden identities, particularly for anybody who does business in the US. So, because what the Americans have done is they can sequestrate wealth. So anybody who does business in America who's can be traced back, well, I can't think of another terrorist. I'll pick Gaddafi, who's no longer with us, but someone like that, or someone from a terrorist empire or politically, challenger to America, they will try and seize their wealth. The American government will. So who can do that? Well, that's going to be some lawyers and accountants to try and find out all these dummy corporations. And I'm sure they're doing, there's quite a lot of that being threatened with Assad in Syria at the moment. So wealth in Europe, the British and the French and the Germans and others have said any of the European assets of the Syrian leadership will be seized or frozen anyway. Sometimes they'll seize it, particularly in terrorist cases. So finding ownership structures is really important. But this is more from a corporate governance point of view, but I was just giving that example that these powers are now being extended significantly in this case. And the point that we'll look at in a few moments is all this stuff about executive remuneration. That's really significant. These are our general rules. You've probably heard about these since the day you first studied an accounting course about reliable information. And your textbook was just showing you that there's lots of different theories about reliable and accurate and what it all means. But this is sort of the objective that we want. Independent auditors who are independent. How do you ensure independence? Now, last week, Alex Malley, who's the president of CPA, wrote an interesting piece in the newspaper I was reading. And one of the issues about independence is whether you can have a time limit on it. if you're the auditor of a company for 57 years, are you independent of that company? What's your view? You have any ideas? You think you get to know the client pretty well after 57 years because there's been lots of managers, lots of businesses. So one of the rules about audit independence that's been adopted is normally we have a time limit on auditor appointment. So usually a 5-year cycle. So an auditor shouldn't be involved in auditing the same company for more than about 5 years. You're going to get to know and become too dependent. We know that's what happened in Enron. The auditor's done that forever. Same company, they go to lunch together, play golf together, their mums and wives and husbands, everybody goes to the same club, they go to the same political party donation, beneficiary dinners, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the auditors and the company executives, close. Their kids go to the same schools, whatever, they go to the same opera house, they support the same charities. So the auditors were not independent in many sense. And that comes because they're close, they're in the same community, and this is one of the dangers, Auditors are often highly paid, chief executives highly paid, probably going to have houses in the same neighbourhood, in the rich part of the city, they have this, the same, as I said, golf club, yacht club memberships or whatever they join up with, that's where they're going to be. So independent auditing is the cornerstone of that's the philosophy behind auditing. But nearly all of the corporate frauds that we've found through history have been because the auditors got too close. And they didn't ask the questions. They were not being objective. Oh, he's my friend, or she's my friend. I go to the same golf. They wouldn't be stealing money. They wouldn't be doing that. They never questioned them, never put the hard words on them. So there's been a lot of debate. Anyway, Alex Malley wrote about this because there's a case just come up recently where one Australian company's had the same auditing firm for 57 years. And the question is, are they really independent? Should we have a law in Australia that requires auditor turnover after a certain number of years? So auditors actually, they go to jail because if they don't get this right, where does the buck normally stop? It stops with the auditor. The auditors need to pay huge fines because they have huge professional insurances now over their work. So a lot of interesting stuff about auditors, auditor independence, and auditor objectivity to build investor shareholder confidence. Now we talked about this before. I don't know whether we need to go through that, but this is really what a board should be doing, providing that strategy, guiding the company, and having these standards of integrity and working in the best interest of all shareholders, not just the group. And the key thing is monitoring management. So board monitors management on behalf of the shareholders. That's a really important dimension. If you don't have that separation of board and management, basically then the management just becomes a piggy bank for the board. They just can take all the money from the company without independent scrutiny. So we've got here some general principles from the OECD about how the board should operate. Firstly, the board should be responsible for its own decision making and shouldn't delegate that to the management. And the board should be objective and independent in its decision making. And as I mentioned, use the non-executive independent directors and remove executive directors if there are conflicts of interest, or if there are non-executive directors who have significant relationships with the company, maybe through other companies they're involved in, etc. They also may have conflict of interest, so that all conflicts of interest should be disclosed. So most board meetings, the very first agenda item is, after maybe a welcome or something, is declaration of conflicts of interest. That's a pretty standard procedure in all board meetings. Anybody that's got a conflict of interest with any items has to declare that. And normally, if the conflicts are significant, then the person is asked to leave the meeting while that particular matter is discussed. So they don't participate in decision making about areas where they have a conflict of interest. So these kind of protocols and practices are very important to keep. So these are the sorts of things we talked about in terms of strategy setting, where the company is going, how risky is it going to be, should it take over other companies or really big investment decisions, key financing decisions, and most importantly, who gets paid money, and how much is the remuneration for the CEO and other directors. We talked about the composition of the board. I talked about diversity and how we get a good mix. Normally, we've got specialist committees. Some boards will have lots. Common ones are nomination committees, so who gets to be on the board and who is going to be a new member. The audit committee, who's going to be responsible for relationships between the board and the external auditors, and remuneration committee, who is responsible for advising on the pay of the executives in particular. Clear distinction between the board and management, and as I said, the key is skills, experience, and diversity. Getting that balance right. There's no magic formula to say we're going to get it all by doing this. And generally, according to our corporate governance principles, we should have more non-executives or independent directors than we have executives, so we don't get the balance the wrong way around. Otherwise, the execs would still run the board. Leadership, which is our very first point we talked about, setting up the board, running it. The board has a range of overall responsibilities, including its own performance management. So most boards always have an annual performance review to check out how the board runs, independent of executive remuneration and performance. And there are specialist companies and groups that work and consult in board performance and board operations. So that's an interesting area of management consultancy. The specialist nomination committee is responsible for identifying and then nominating potential new board members. Most boards have usually appointments made for either a 3 or a 5-year sort of term when a board member comes up. And if you've got, say, 7 members or so on a board, you might have 2 members every year who are re-elected, and then a 3 in every third year. You'll have 3 members, so you've constantly got a rollover of membership. Now, often boards just re-nominate the existing board members. Sometimes the issue is that usually at a shareholders meeting, if there are 2 vacancies, there are 2 nominations. So shareholders basically have to elect the same people back. So it's not quite the same as political nominations where there may be competing interests, mainly because in a company situation, the company has very set purpose and objectives, as distinct from political organisations where there are much more competition and much more likely to be division in the board, whereas in corporate boards, normally if people don't agree with the direction of the board, the first thing they do is resign from the board. They don't stay on. Whereas in a political organisation, people will stay on, and then you have the competition within the board. So corporate boards tend to be singular in their mission and purpose, and people who disagree with the board or disagree with, say, the risk appetite or the strategy, they just resign from the board, and you get someone in who's going to commit to the strategic direction. And so these sorts of things here are critical for nomination committee. Talked about composition. One of the key features is this distinction between chairman and a CEO, making sure that's separated. And you also have independent non-executive directors as So what we might have here is non-executive directors, but if you had your old previous chief executive, they retire, they then become non-executive, but they're not really independent because they've got a past history with the company. So there's a whole lot of rules that have been developed defining what is independent as distinct from what is a non-executive role. And that's to try and minimise conflicts of interest. We've talked about this again, even within Australia we've got a number of companies, but generally most Australian companies, or certainly the majority, have distinct chairmen or chairpeople and CEOs, and clearly having the chair, where there's conflict, we normally, we'll look at that. I think recently, in the last few weeks, there was an interesting discussion about Citibank, one of the big US banks, and there was a conflict between the CEO of Citibank and the chair of Citibank board. The CEO resigned. The Citibank has now appointed a new CEO because of a conflict in direction of where the bank was heading between the board and the CEO. So we talked about these distinctions between non-executive and independent. So a non-executive is defined here as someone who doesn't have a current executive management type role in the company, whereas independent is distinguishing those who don't have any conflict of interest or potential or actual conflict of interest with the company. So they are not related to the company in any way, either through financing, through cross ownership, through private equity ownership and things like that. Now the question then for independence is, how do we, this will come up when we talk about remuneration, how do we pay these kind of people? Should they have shares in the company? And the old theory, as we know with agency theory, is it's good if people have shares in the business because that will align them with the goals of the business. So if someone's not getting any equity interest or doesn't have any equity interest in the business, what is in their interest to be, to be motivated to make that company work? So there's a lot of different theories about what is best for a company and whether independent directors, that is truly independent directors, are actually the best kinds of people. And if so, how do we remunerate them? Do we give them any profit incentive? Do they get any performance bonus? And a lot of the strict literature says that independent non-executives shouldn't even be linked to corporate performance. Otherwise, they then get caught in this loop, and they're going to have incentives to start to manipulate performance because they're going to benefit from it. So there's still a very strong debate going on in the corporate world about how those relationships should be managed. So theoretically, non-executive directors are primarily focused on setting strategy. That is then given to CEOs to implement. They should be the key people to scrutinise performance. They shouldn't have an incentive in performance themselves, but should be able to objectively look at that without any personal risk. They need to be able to monitor the risk and control systems of the company, and they need to be the people responsible for all remuneration and the audit committee, because these are ultimately the gatekeepers for the company, the independent non-executive directors. So this is just listed here some of the things where there may be conflicts that mean a person is not independent. See this sort of guidance here about was fairly recently. Well, if you're the CEO or the CFO 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when do you become independent? So we've got different rules in Canada, Australia, America, all of the countries. some have 2 years, some have 18 months, some have 12 months. Is it from the day you last worked? Is it from the day you last took a contract? When is the effective date? How much time is fairly recently? So when does someone become independent or not independent? And this again, it gets back to rule making and rule ticking. There's no universal answer. These are just general principles. It's interesting. I did some research on this a few years ago, and we looked at all the rules around the world. They're all different. Every single country's got a different rule. And some are start dates. Is it the last date you worked as an executive? Whereas sometimes you get delayed compensation. If you worked and then you took 12 months long service leave, but you got paid for all that, does that count? And then is it 3 years after that or before that? Or does this, I just took 12 months off, I'll just come back now after 12 months and be a non-executive. I'm independent now. Any future. So these are the kind of questions you need to look at or get discussed anyway, certainly by regulators. And this also applies to auditors. When do auditors become independent? Because auditors usually some of the people who get appointed to board of directors are the auditors. The auditors got around audited all this, and they used to then just join the company board of directors. Oh, just finished the audit report. Oh, fine, bang, I'm on the directors. I even become the chairman of the company. And then the company would go broke after the auditors done the audits for a few years. So very interesting stuff. Lots of good stories about conflicts there. So again, how transparent is this process? A lot more pressure now on making a lot of this much more public. In the past, it was often done in the boardrooms or club rooms of business or sporting clubs to figure out who was the next person, and in introducing performance reviews for directors. The audit committee, special committee of the board. Most countries now have a legal requirement for an audit committee. Most audit committees comprise 3 members. So an audit committee is a subcommittee of this board. So if you've got only 5 or a small number of, you've got to have at least 3 of these as independent. There should be no executives at all or non-independent directors on the audit committee. It should be fully independent. But that doesn't, although they're the rules, it doesn't always get implemented in all countries. And if audit committees work well, does that increase performance? So we've had research done in a number of countries to look at the relationship between audit committees and corporate performance. And the person who's the chair of the audit committee should clearly be independent, an independent director. And the audit committee has certain tasks, in particular dealing with the external auditor, so that management is separated away from influencing the external auditor. So they have a responsibility to oversight financial reporting process, sit down, negotiate the terms of the audit and the audit process with the external auditor, review any internal audit systems, review all this, the independence of, and more or less to ensure that the external auditor is not contaminated by internal management. And then they should be involved in all this negotiation and or removal of auditors if there are unsatisfactory performance of external auditors. So that's the sorts of things that audit committees do. Now keep in mind the audit committee doesn't sign off the financial statements. The board of directors signs the financial statements on behalf of the whole board. So audit committee only makes recommendations to boards. It's not the final decision maker in terms of financial reporting. Now, it's noted that not all of these people here who are on the board of directors will be accountants or qualified in financial decision making. So an audit committee may have non-accountants as members. I've served on some audit committees on boards. Generally, the ones I've been on, and they may be a bit unique, have all been made up of accountants. So that issue issue hasn't arisen in ones that I'm actually familiar with. One of the big topics today is executive remuneration. It's always in the media, in the newspaper. A whole lot of general principles about who sets the remuneration, how that gets built into to make sure you get the best people and you get the right outcomes. And we've seen a lot more disclosure. So you can see executive remuneration reports in company accounts today, 50, 60, 80 pages, sometimes 100 pages more of detail. So we know a lot more about what executives get paid today. One of the big problems is it's often impenetrable. No one either can spend the time to sit down and read it, or if they do, they can't understand it because it's very, very complex. We did a lot of work. I worked for CARMAC, I mentioned to you earlier, the Corporations Markets Advisory Committee. We did a review of the executive remuneration policy in Australia recently. It's basically a big teams of lawyers from the CEO and the company sitting down negotiating executive contracts. Remuneration committees normally employ remuneration consultants to advise the committees on current industry standards for remuneration and the kind of mix. It's up to the committees to decide what they want to pay. I just read last week, you may have seen, Yahoo has just been poaching a number of staff from Google, including their new CEO and CFO. That is for Yahoo. They got all the, because Google's been doing better than Yahoo lately. Yahoo wants to improve its position. I can't remember what the CEO got, but the CFO for Yahoo was signed on for 55 million US as a golden handcuffs. You know, they get you, they want to keep you, so they wrap you in a pile of money and say you're working for us now to give up. So and that was the bit that was written up in the paper, like the sign-on bonus. So we'll sign you up. It's a bit like the football players. We want you to play for our team now, so we'll give you a pile of money, and now you switch sides. Same in the executive remuneration states. Big sign-on bonuses now, often with what we call parachutes. So if you get out, you get kicked out, you get a big bucket of money to go sailing down with, usually also in the tens or hundreds of millions, depending on the business you're in. Very complex structures. This is only a few dot points here. Most of the CEO contracts probably run to 1,000 pages or more now for a big public company, in terms of all of the benefits and conditions and entitlements and how they get earned and performance. So very, very complex documentation surrounding CEO and senior executive remuneration. Arguments, why is this so complex? Well, we need the best people. And as I said, there's only a few thousand companies in the world that really, at the high end, particularly in the financial services industry, they have very big salaries, mostly in the multiple tens of millions, and sometimes well exceeding $100 million a year compensation for top executive talent in financial institutions. In non-financial institutions, salaries probably for senior execs at the CEO level in the top corporations well in excess of 10 million today, including all their bonuses and incentives and share contracts and things like that. Timing, disclosure, measurement of all these, very complex, and again, take a lot of detail and a lot of accounting, and of course the accountants have to prepare all of these, you have to measure all that, measure performance, and then remuneration treaties to sign on the payments. A lot more disclosure. Australia brought in its two-strike rule last year, so this year we've got our first set of strikes against companies, and the two strikes relate to executive remuneration. Shareholders, only 25% of shareholders, so it's pretty small, get to decide whether they agree with the remuneration of the executives. So executive remuneration can be voted down, two strikes and the board's out, kicked out, the board vacated. So we'll find out next year what the consequences consequence of that is Australia is the only country in the world that has a two-strikes rule. And it's only 25% of shareholders get to implement that. As I mentioned, growing shareholder activism. A lot of people, a lot of shareholders have been very concerned about executive salaries going up and their shareholder value going down. That's happened a lot lately. So we've got this disconnect. Shareholders are quite happy if they're getting more and more money every year, and the executive gets more money, great. But now we've got this separation. Shareholders are being very critical. Governments are being critical. Why are executives getting paid more? And we've actually seen some executives, like Marius Copper's BHP, took a big drop in his salary because they wrote down the value of a number of mines. BHP Billiton wrote down a number of its corporate assets in value due to falling commodity prices. He didn't get any bonuses, so he lost a lot. And we've seen a lot now being reported. Executives actually, for the first time in probably ever, starting to get paid less than they did the year before when the company doesn't perform bad. In the past, every year used to be more. So this is a very dynamic space, this whole area of shareholder alignment and executive remuneration. As I said, extensive disclosure is a cornerstone of good corporate governance. We talked about that quite a lot, and that's really the theme of this course. Lots of disclosure about corporate governance policy. So most companies now, the very first thing you'll read is their corporate governance statement and their corporate governance disclosures. So I've got you to the end of those slides, just in the nick of time for you to go. Okay, that's pretty good. Any questions?
No.
I've bombarded you with lots of information?
Yeah.
Okay, well I hope you've enjoyed this course. Have you enjoyed it?
Yeah.
Yeah? You're going to make use of this information in your future careers. You're all going to be CEOs, you're going to know how to wipe the shareholders' money and put it all into your own bank account. No. You're not going to do that. You're going to be ethical, good, ethical people, responsible. That's very good. Well, I wish you all the very best in your exams, completing this course, and in whatever career you have in the future. Okay?
Thank you
Hope
so
you have
much.
very good success.
Thank
you.
Thank you guys.
Very good. You've been good students. Happy to talk with you. But again, if you've got any questions or you're looking at any further information about accounting, please always come and have a talk with me, or you can talk to Yung and he'll